My wife and I have been married for 5 years. She is a thoughtful woman, devoted to both her work and our family. We used to be deeply in love, but recently, everything has felt dull. Our married life no longer carries the same laughter it once did. My wife is often busy with her job, spending less and less time at home, and our conversations have become limited to work or mundane daily topics. I never thought I would do something to hurt her. Even when I felt neglected, I constantly reminded myself that love isn't always as romantic as it is at the beginning. My wife's best friend, H, is a young, strong-willed woman. She's a single mother who got divorced a few years ago and is now raising her child alone. H works at the same company as my wife, so they often meet and confide in each other. Sometimes, she stops by our house to help when my wife or I need something, and I considered her a friend as well. The story began when H asked me to come over to her place to fix a light bulb. It was a trivial request, and I didn't think much about it. That afternoon, I went to her apartment as promised. Her home was small but cozy, and when I arrived, she greeted me with a grateful smile that unexpectedly made me feel at ease. While I was fixing the bulb, we started talking. H opened up about the pressures of being a single mother and the lonely nights she endured without anyone by her side. After I finished, I was about to leave, but she urged me to stay, suggesting I relax and have a cup of tea. Every word, every glance, seemed to draw us closer together. I don't know the exact moment when I crossed the line. Perhaps it was when I saw the vulnerability in her eyes. Perhaps it was when I realized how empty I felt in my own marriage. I stayed, and we ended up sleeping together. I thought it was just a one-time mistake. After that night, I swore to myself that it would never happen again. But every time I saw H, her gaze and her gestures made it impossible for me to resist. The second time and then the third time happened quickly, and I knew I was sinking deeper into a vortex of guilt. H called me one afternoon. Her voice was tense but resolute. "I'm pregnant. You are the father." It felt like my entire world was crumbling. I didn't know how to react. My mind was torn apart. Images of my wife, my conscience screaming at me, and now the responsibility H was asking me to bear. H didn't demand that I leave my wife, but she wanted me to acknowledge the child, to legally become the father, and to help raise the baby. She said the child didn't deserve to grow up without a father, like her first child had. When I heard H say she was pregnant, I was speechless. I felt paralyzed, and my thoughts were in chaos. Was this the price I had to pay for my moments of weakness? I asked again, my voice full of doubt. "Are you sure? This can't be, I'm certain." "The child is yours," H confirmed. Her tone wasn't threatening or resentful. It was simply a statement of fact, one I couldn't deny. In the days that followed, I lived in a state of complete panic. My mind was consumed by countless questions. How could I face my wife? If she found out the truth, would our marriage fall apart? Am I truly ready to be the father of this child? Guilt weighed heavily on my chest every time I looked at my wife. She had no idea, continuing to chat about stories from work, occasionally mentioning H as the friend she trusted the most. This only made me feel even more wretched. H asked to meet me to discuss the baby's future. During the meeting, she didn't blame me but instead expressed her wishes. "I don't need you to leave your family. But the child needs a father. Have you thought about this?" Her words were like a dagger to my conscience. A father, I couldn't even begin to imagine. But I knew she was right. A child shouldn't have to suffer the absence of a father because of adult mistakes. I asked, my voice trembling, if I can't openly acknowledge this, what will you do? I will do whatever it takes to protect my child. But I don't want them to grow up not knowing who their father is, H replied. I felt suffocated. Her words made me realize that, whether I wanted to or not, I couldn't escape this responsibility. Fear haunted me constantly. On one hand, I wanted to run away, to pretend none of this had happened. But on the other hand, I knew that doing so would not only destroy my own life, but also hurt the people I cared about. I thought about my wife. If she found out the truth, would she forgive me, or would she see me as an irredeemable traitor? I thought about H, a woman who had already been hurt once and now had to face this situation alone. And I thought about the baby, a completely innocent being, unaware of the painful circumstances of their conception. H began pressing me for a decision. She didn't want to prolong the waiting. I didn't blame her, knowing she was also under immense pressure. But I still couldn't answer. I lived in torment every day. Every night, I lay awake, imagining the worst scenarios. My wife discovering the truth and leaving me. My family falling apart. Or worse, the story spreading, and all of us becoming subjects of judgment. I turned to alcohol in an attempt to drown my fears, but it only made everything worse. The more I drank, the clearer it became that I couldn't keep running away. I had to do something. One night, I sat at my desk, facing the mirror, looking straight at myself. I saw a weak, cowardly, and guilty man. I could no longer keep running away. I had to face everything, no matter how painful the consequences might be. I decided to talk to each one last time before making my final choice. During our meeting, I honestly confessed, H, I will take responsibility for the child. But I cannot let my family fall apart. H was silent for a long time before nodding. Fine. I only need you to be the father of the child, nothing more. But if you can't do that, I'll raise the baby on my own. I felt somewhat relieved, but the fear still didn't subside. I didn't know what to say to my wife. Should I confess everything, or keep it a secret and live with this guilt for the rest of my life? In the days that followed, I kept asking myself, how did I let things come to this? How could I betray the woman who had given everything for me? And is there any way to fix the mistakes I've made? I understand now that no one can decide for me. This is my responsibility, the consequence of moments of weakness that I must bear. I am still searching for the answer, but perhaps any choice will leave behind pain. I scheduled a meeting with my wife, knowing that it would be the hardest conversation of my life. I chose a quiet evening, when she had just returned home from work. She looked tired, but still greeted me with a soft smile. I have something important to tell you, I began, my voice trembling. She looked at me with concern, not realizing the weight of the storm about to hit. I explained everything, how I had betrayed her trust, how it had started with H, and the fact that H was now pregnant. With every word I spoke, I felt the devastation in her eyes, her disbelief slowly turning into heartbreak. When I finished, silence filled the room. Tears streamed down her face as she finally broke the silence. How could you do this to me, to us? And with my best friend, I had no words to justify myself. All I could say was, I know I've hurt you deeply. I don't expect forgiveness, but I couldn't keep this from you. You deserve the truth. She didn't say anything else. She left the house that night, slamming the door behind her. I called her, but she didn't pick up. I was left sitting alone, the weight of my actions crashing down on me. H continued to call me during this time, asking for clarity about how we would handle the situation moving forward. She didn't demand that I leave my wife, but she made it clear that the child needed a father and that she couldn't do it alone. I felt trapped between two impossible choices. My marriage was in ruins, and I now bore the responsibility of a child I had not planned for. In my desperation, I sought the help of a therapist. I explained everything: the affair, the pregnancy, my crumbling marriage. The therapist listened without judgment and gave me advice that, while simple, felt like a lifeline. Take responsibility for your actions. Understand that no solution will be perfect, but you must prioritize honesty and accountability. The therapist suggested that I arrange a meeting with both my wife and each to have an open conversation about the future. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to try and move forward. The meeting was one of the most painful experiences of my life. My wife refused to look at H and began by asking, Why would you do this to me? I trusted you both." H, tears streaming down her face, replied, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen. But now, there's a child involved, and I need to think about its future." The conversation was long and filled with anger, sadness, and regret. I admitted my mistakes and expressed my willingness to support the child. My wife, however, said she needed time to think about whether she could continue in this marriage. Eventually, my wife decided to separate from me. She said she couldn't rebuild trust after such a betrayal. Though I had hoped for forgiveness, I understood her decision. With H, I agreed to support her and the child financially and emotionally. While I couldn't openly be a father due to the complicated situation, I committed to being present in the child's life as much as possible. This experience has been a harsh but invaluable lesson for me. I've learned that boundaries in relationships are essential, that marriage requires constant effort, and that even one moment of weakness can have lifelong consequences. To my wife, I caused irreparable pain. Through her reactions, I've come to understand. Trust is fragile and, once broken, is almost impossible to restore. Betrayal is not just a physical act but an emotional one. It's prioritizing someone else over the promises you've made. From H, I've also learned, being a single mother is incredibly challenging. Taking responsibility for one's actions is difficult but necessary, even when the situation feels impossible. My story is not a happy one. It's a tale of mistakes, pain, and difficult choices. But it's also a story about responsibility and facing the consequences of one's actions. I've hurt my wife, my friend, and an innocent child who did not choose to be born under these circumstances. The repercussions of my actions will ripple through all of our lives. While I cannot undo what I've done, I hope that time will heal the wounds I've caused. I hope my wife finds peace, H finds stability, and I can fulfill my role as a father to this child. Above all, I've learned to confront my mistakes as lessons for growth and to ensure I never repeat them. My story is not an isolated one. In life, There are times when we are weak and make mistakes, but what is important is how we face and make up for those mistakes. I tell this story not to seek sympathy, but to send a message. Never take lightly the boundaries in relationships. Cherish those who love you, because once you hurt them, you may never get back what you have lost. And finally, learn to face mistakes. That is the only way to truly grow. The story ends, but the lesson remains. This is a human journey with mistakes, pain and hope. If you are facing choices, think carefully, because sometimes a moment of weakness can have lifelong consequences.